Cool. So yeah, hello everyone. I'm so hyped about this conference. I'm finally here, and it's great to be with all of you. Thank you for having me. And yeah, I am Matheus Albuquerque, and we are here to discuss about Atomic CSS and a lot of things in its ecosystem. So these are the topics we're going to cover today. So we'll discuss a few things I consider to be bad takes around this, not only Tailwind, but other libraries and Atomic CSS in general. We'll discuss what's kind of bad or even ugly about the idea. And then we'll discuss the good way of doing a lot of things. And then, last but not least, we'll draft a few thoughts on top of everything we went through. But before I start, I do have to do an intermission. So for those of you who are not familiar with the idea of Atomic CSS, basically we're talking to this approach of writing CSS where we have these single purpose class, and the names, they are based on their visual function. So if you're familiarized with semantic CSS, where in a card you would have this class name equals to card, for example, we're talking about going into something like this, where we would have this bunch of class names and their visual functions. And I want to hear from you, like a little bit of raise your hand. So who here is using or has used, it might be Tailwind, Deshaun's, your own implementation. Okay, cool, quite a few. I would say a bit more than half of you. Cool. So for those who raised your hands, tell me about your experiences, like your feelings, like a word or two about that. For example, perhaps it was easy to use, or nah, it's hard to read, or if you consider that it's sort of an anti-pattern, or no, you like it because it brings consistency. I really need your help. I'm gonna leave this QR code for the next 40 seconds. It's really easy. All you gotta do is quickly scan it, and like a word or two, how has been your experience with Atomic CSS, no matter which library? And yeah, 40 seconds is actually a lot of time if you have to make some small talk. But yeah, so I still see some of you are taking photos. So yeah, 8, 7, 6. Cool, I think we're good to move forward. We'll discuss this in a minute, by the way. So back to our original thing. So let's talk a little bit this good, bad, and ugly thing. But you're probably used to this cliche of good, bad, and ugly, so I want to start a different way. And I want to talk about a few things that are kind of bad takes on the topic. And first and most likely, this one that you might have heard, you might as well use inline styles. And that's not true. First thing is because inline styles, they're really costly for the browser, not only because it takes a lot of computation to convert those strings that we see into the native representations for the browser, but also because inline styles, each of them, they could trigger reflow. And if you have even in the same style thing, you could have multiple reflows. So performance-wise, it's just not the same. Also, inline styles just can handle things like media query or pseudo selectors. And you don't have to follow pre-existing definitions just like you would have with atomic class names. Because with atomic class names, what you usually have most of the time is a very well-defined API, and then it kind of acts as your single source of truth, or it's supposed to. Another thing we hear a lot is, okay, it's just adding a lot of unnecessary bloat to your HTML, so it's just making things huge, and that can be a performance problem. But we're in an age where we have a lot of compression algorithms, and Deflate, for example, is focused on handling things like duplicate strings and that kind of thing. So we have technology to handle that. And also, if you think the other way around, when you do semantic CSS and stuff like that, you might end up with a lot of selectors being repeated, and the more it happens in the style sheet, that might be the more work the browser has to do. So in a sense, you could even have performance gains by leveraging Atomic CSS. We probably hear this a lot as well. So what about separation of concerns? You're just breaking separation of concerns. But I think it takes a little bit of a mind shift to realize that okay, the style composition, it is actually performed in the HTML, but it's not like we're using style, align, or width, height, those attributes. No. What we have is the pieces, they are assembled in the HTML, but they are coming from a style sheet that we created. So the HTML here is more like of a consumer of a CSS API that we just created. And overall, a lot of the concerns I see when it comes to separation of concerns, they are coming from a very, very extreme and sometimes even dogmatic interpretation of what separation of concerns actually means. And React and JSX have been in this place before. And that's why, for example, Vue.js, in their documentation, they cover the topic of separation of concerns versus separation of file types and how these are not always the same thing. And then I could go here all day. Things like, okay, but if you're using Atomic CSS, it's complicated to do theming or redesigning things, or you just end up with a bunch of unused CSS, or it's actually hard to know because I have to go frequently to the docs, or even like, I don't want to learn another language. I know CSS, so why would I go with Atomic CSS? And so on. But the point is, I think that technologies like Tailwind, the way they are these days, they have the potential to alleviate all of those concerns that back in the day they made a lot of sense, but nowadays, and even you can bring in a lot of new benefits that we didn't think of. But okay, now that we got these out of our ways, I wanted to cover a few things that I kind of don't feel very well about them. And the first one are the bad claims we have around this topic. And these have been here all the way, ever since, for example, this was the first post about Atomic CSS back in 2013. And here you have this: simple changes to the style of our module have resulted in new rules to the style sheet. But if we think about it, CSS is supposed to define the style and layout of a page. And if you're modifying it, it's okay that you have to modify. And by the way, this doesn't mean you necessarily have to add more and more rules and selectors. And if we fast forward in time, we have things like rapidly build modern websites without ever leaving your HTML. But I think there's a dangerous assumption being made here. It's like switching between HTML and CSS all the time is a pain. And it's actually not. I mean, if you're tweaking your markup constantly for style changes, it might mean that you're treating your HTML like just an extension of the CSS, and that can be actually a red flag. Not to mention more extreme stuff like, you know what, best practices, they don't actually work. That's not like a great way to sell. So overall, in the community, I see this belief that Tailwind and other technologies before them, it's the future of front end. If you're not using to do styling these days, you're just doing it wrong. So yeah, bad claims. Second thing is what a lot of people call the utility CSS lock-in. So let's do this mental exercise. Let's say we have our web page using semantic HTML and CSS, and we want to migrate that towards Tailwind or another library. So what we would do, refactoring, is we would break our semantic classes into those atomic utility classes, and every of them would have single responsibilities. And if you think about it, of course, depending on the size, there will be a lot of refactoring, but that's a fairly easy thing to do. And it's no wonder that we have tools like Wendy that automatically goes through your code using semantic CSS and generates atomic Tailwind classes out of it. But if we shift and try to think of the opposite, so let's say we have Tailwind or Atomic CSS and we want to convert that into semantic classes, it's really hard to picture a similar tool that would do that, because you can't really build more complex without assembling things by hand like you would do with the other. So most of the times, it is only realistic that you think about converting Atomic CSS from one library or implementation to another. And that makes that if you want to move to any other framework or preprocessor or any other strategy of doing CSS, that would be a considerable amount of refactoring. And I know what you're thinking. It's not like we're swapping CSS technologies in our projects every semester. But the thing is, this is an important consideration to have in mind if you're talking about something you want to maintain in the long run, and I'm talking like years and years. This is kind of more Tailwind specific, but that could apply to other stuff as well, or missing key CSS features. Let me give you an example. So back, after 2 years of Tailwind's existence, they still didn't have pseudo selectors, which are a very, very common CSS resource. And that's something that CSS and a lot of preprocessors and other tools in the ecosystems have had for years. And for a while, that was the case with pseudo selectors, but that was the same thing with background gradients or even animations. Now it's the same thing with selectors like is and where, or new functions that we have like min and max. But this extends to any other bleeding edge technology that CSS gets. You kind of have to wait, and that might be a long wait. And this one is definitely more Tailwind specific, is their internal mechanism to do class detection. So some of you probably know that, but Tailwind doesn't actually parse or execute any of your code. The way it works is it uses regexes to basically go and find anything that can possibly be one of its class names. So because of that, it's gonna only find those class names that are complete unbroken strings. And the bottom line here is that you can't really construct class names dynamically, which is a fairly common thing to do in a lot of React apps. And if you check their official documentation, you will even see them highlighting that thing. Cool. So moving forward to the ugly, and yeah, I'm gonna start with the cliche, the hard to scan thing. So let's start with this quick exercise. Let's say we have this div, and we have some styles here. And now I want to support tablet and mobile and etc. So I'm gonna add some media queries here, and it grew a lot. So let's for a second rewrite that with semantic CSS. So here we have our main class, and then we have our 2 media queries for different resolutions. Now let's say we're trying to track down a UI issue here, but we know it's not specific to a given resolution, so we can ignore that for a while and focus here. And this is just easier for us to scan, and let me tell you why. First, because it's easier for us if we can just go from the top to the bottom of something. It's just the way how we read. The second thing is, it's really easier for us if we can work with very specific pairs and keys and values, properties and values. And not only that, if we leverage that, we have proper syntax highlighting to show us what exactly each property and values are. And you could think that that was an access beta example, but it's not hard to find scenarios where we would have 70, 80, or even more class names altogether. This one I took from Netlify, but that could be an app I wrote or any of you wrote. Second thing is what some people call the encouraged text soup. So, and that's not a Tailwind thing, but with most of Atomic CSS, the focus is on the classes, not on the markup. So before we move forward, don't get me wrong, it's not like Tailwind, they're promoting ugly HTML, nothing like that. But you can throw in as many divs as you want, and you just don't have to care about their meaning. And the result is you can do things the right way, but it's just easier for a lot of times if you don't. So here's a very famous example taken from one of the Tailwind UI's projects. This is their paid UI kit, and this is the footer. And you can see like a lot of nested divs that many of them don't even have to be there. So I think that the problem here is we're thinking CSS classes first, and instead of starting with the markup and working the CSS from there. And if I were to move forward this hot take, I think that usually tools, they can make it easy to do certain things the wrong way. And that's perhaps what happens here, because the approach makes poor semantics the easy path. I think that Tony summarizes it really well with the idea of this mindset where okay, I need somewhere to put my class, so let me just add another div here. And if I were to move forward with the hot takes, I think that optimizing for developer happiness and productivity is great, but it can be dangerous if you're doing this at the cost of readability, maintainability, and even accessibility. And yes, accessibility, because if you move forward and you see this one is taken for another very popular repository for Tailwind examples. In this snippet of Dawn, you see, for example, endless divs, an empty heading to, placeholders that are doing the job of a label, or spans that are doing the other job, or a span that should be a heading. So a lot of issues. Those are really common. And for some apps, that might not be a problem, but depending on how deep you go with nested Dawn, that can actually be. So there's this very common guideline that's been there for a couple years now, showing how we should avoid excessive Dawn size, and depending on your public, that's really important. There's this performance inequality gap that is published with a certain frequency. And it, for example, shows how important it is to think about people in different parts of the world that are using low-end devices, where having like really, really huge Dawn structure can actually be bad for their experience using your website. Another thing is the developer experience. So I want to talk about two situations here. The first one is when we want to find components. So let's say you are troubleshooting a large code base. So it's important that you can narrow down where that visual problem is. So what usually helps us is when we have a close mapping between the component names and the class names of that component. So it's easy to find things. But here, we just have two options. Either we know very well that particular area of the app, or we use strings and query those strings for the class names by strings using Dawn APIs. But the first thing is, not everyone knows very well all the parts of the app. So think about enterprise scale monorepos, or think about people who just joined the company or your team. And the second problem is, in Atomic CSS, it's very often that you have strings being reused multiple times. So if you're querying for that strings, you can have a lot of results that's not what you're looking for. So basically, the result is it's usually hard to determine where a module starts and it ends. And again, that's not a Tailwind thing. This post is from a few years ago, and it's reporting the exact same problem, but with ACSS. Another thing is, okay, we want to debug, but it's also common that we want to make small UI tweaks too. Before we make them in the code, we want to experiment with them in the dev tools. So that's a common practice. But here, again, either we give each component, we want to make this a style tweak a new class name, or we use inline styles. But the problem is, if we use inline styles, then we don't see the results of our experiments reflected throughout the rest of the UI. So yeah. We talk a lot about the bad, the ugly, some wrong claims, and etc. I also wanted to discuss the good way of doing some things. The first one is on-demand generation. So you're probably familiar with that, but if you're not, let's start with an exercise. So let's say we want to build our utility classes. And here's an example where I'm iterating 1 through 10 to generate something like this. So I have m-1, m-2, and all the way to 10 to be our utility classes for margin. The issue here is there's a huge gap between the CSS that is generated and the CSS that you're gonna use, and you might be lacking some CSS, you might have to purge things, and etc. So that's how it works without on-demand generation. If you use on-demand generation, you scan the CSS you are actually using, and that's all you're gonna generate. This has been an option in Tailwind since version 2, and it's actually the default in version 3. And if you use stuff like GUNO CSS, you also get this out of the box. But if you don't, or if you use your own Atomic CSS utility, I would definitely recommend that. Another thing is, please be aware of the apply directive. So this is something that even Adam, the creator of Tailwind, he recommended people not to use almost never. And I think that apply is dangerous because basically you're negating most of the benefits you gained over component-driven CSS. So you miss the explicitness of the class name you had, You miss the time you saved by not having to write your own CSS, and you missed your single source of truth that you had with your utility first classes. And it's really common, and you have a lot of posts out there recommending that go ahead and just use apply. So to illustrate, that's what I'm talking about. Here we have background white and padding large, and then just card. So this is dangerous because you might just use those functional classes as an escape hatch to undo the component rules. So if you are using it, you have to be really, really strict and try not to intersect or have their responsibilities colliding. Another thing is type safety. So I feel like this has been like a barrier for a lot of people to adopt Tailwind and other technologies, because a lot of people just wanted what they have with Material UI or Chakra or even CSS and JS. But the thing is, luckily, these days we have tools like Tailwind or Tailwind CSS class names that brings to the Tailwind all the TypeScript experience we have, like zero runtime, type safety, compile time things, catching errors, all the great editor experience. Another thing is the style sheet composition. So if you have written a UI library before, that's something really important. There's this library called Tailwind Merge. It is really, really helpful. So let's say you can use that with a class names utility like CLSX, and you can create your own class names function using Tailwind Merge. And you're gonna use it like this. So let's say you have your input component, but because it's part of a UI kit, you wanna get class name as a prop so that you can, for example, add some flexibility to it. So Tailwind Merge is going to, under the hood, figure out any conflicts that you might get by doing so. And for more complex cases, you might also want to check CVA or class variance authority. One great example is creating a button. So, for example, let's say we have a button component. Our button can have some intent, so it can be primary, secondary, etc. We might also want to get the roundness as a prop and even its size. And we also want to define some default variants. For example, I want that to be median and round, etc., in case it doesn't get any props. And then when creating our button components, we just let CVA do its magic and get all the props, intent, size, roundness, etc. So that's amazing. As you've probably figured by now, it's a lot about tooling. So the things we talked about, for example, how complicated and big it can be to scan and etc. A lot of that can be fixed by leveraging prettier plugins or ESLint plugins, so I definitely recommend it too. And even the accessibility concerns we raised, like we have things like Radix UI, and there's a bunch of resources out there on how to use Tailwind and Radix UI to create beautiful and accessible components. Not to mention that you can do that your own. For example, you can have accessibility in your pipeline, in your build process. You can catch errors with tools like Exit Core, GSX Accessibility, Lighthouse Audits, and etc. And you can go one step further and even that and have that in your CI, for example. So this is ExitLinter and ExitLint are great for that. And then here you can see, for example, in your PRs, you're getting suggestions, hey, this could be an accessibility regression. So that's also great. And then last but not least, there's this thing called Atomic CSS in JS. That could be a whole other session on its own. There's this great post called the shorthand longhand problem in Atomic CSS. And the author makes a really good claim that it allows us to write our styles in a familiar monolithic way, but get Atomic CSS out. So I would definitely recommend you to check it out. There are great sessions by folks from Twitter and Meta on how they leverage that. And this is not a new thing. They've been doing that, even here in past editions of React Rally, by the way. And nowadays we have a lot of libraries that are based on these ideas. So we have Stitches, we have StyleTron, Fila, UIBox, and so on. So yeah, this might be the right flavor of Atomic CSS for some of you. So finally, a few closing thoughts. There's this. There are a lot of posts, and I see a lot of the idea that there's this drama and your users don't care about that, and they don't care about which tools you're using. And that can be true, but you can also find a lot of posts on the internet like this one. There's basically reporting the experience of this team in this project after they migrated their CSS to Tailwind, and that didn't work for them, so they had to run a whole epic to actually undo the Tailwind effort, which means that it didn't work for this project and this team. And that's something we need to take we think about it. And there are even tools like Vanilla Breeze that is an effort to basically convert utility-first CSS back to semantic CSS. So yes, it is just a tool, but if it didn't work for some people, it's important that we think that the right tool can make a huge difference. The second thing is, and that's also another cliche, but the solution to the problem might only change the problem we have. So just like a lot of other things in front end and tech, we have to think about trade-offs, trade-offs, trade-offs. Another thing is utility classes can actually coexist with other approaches. So you might find your sweet spot using something hybrid. And a good example is Bootstrap. In recent releases, they have been adding more and more utility classes while maintaining their old button and those kinds of primitives. And other really popular libraries have been doing the same. Another thing is Tailwind, just like a lot of other things out there, it suffers from a problem that is people tend to think it applies to all the projects. And that might not be true. So if you don't have like a component-based project, for example, Tailwind or Atomic CSS might not be ideal for you. Or for example, if you are using web components and leveraging Shadow DOM kind of is not a match with the whole idea of Atomic CSS. So it doesn't make sense that you complain that you had issues with Lit and Tailwind and that kind of thing. So again, it doesn't apply to everything. One of the last things in the conclusions is this quote by Guillermo Roch, the CEO of Vercel, where he compares the current momentum of Tailwind to what React and JSX had about a decade ago. So at the time, we had this feeling that JSX was going against so many existing best practices that this could never be a good idea. And here we are in a React conference talking about that. So one of the last things, and I hope this work, I wanted to revisit what you said. So yeah, we have easy, better, classes, good, gross, love, piano, bop. So we have kind of moderate opinions here. It could be more polarized. If you've been on Twitter checking discussions or any other forums, you know that this was mild. So I guess that's the last takeaway. I noticed that there's this emotional sides to our developer tech choices these days, and that's really bad. And in other fields, people look at that and then they recognize this is what psychology calls team identification. So I think we should do the same and rethink the way we're facing all of these choices. If you can see me from the back, I look like this. I am Matheus Albuquerque. You can find me everywhere as Y the Combinator. I'm a senior software engineer at Medallia. I mentor front-end students at Tech Labs Berlin, and I'm a GD in the area of performance. The links for these slides and other sessions I have on internals of React, performance, that kind of stuff are under here. If you do have questions, anything to share, feedback, etc., I'm going to be around. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.